Wow. Guys, it's been 2 years, and you know what? This mic has betrayed me. Okay, no sound, dude. How dumb. Anyway, old 2020 sound. This is so predictable, yeah. I like Puneet Inder Singh who says no sound takliya bhai. Very very polite and nice and kind and everything. So, yeah, thanks, I appreciate it. Good now. Okay. Lots to discuss. I read this gentleman's book, Watershed 1967. Been reading it over the last week and a half. I wish I had bought it instead of trying to read the PDF version, which is very annoying. It's terrible. Great t-shirt, great shirt says Sorabh Padvi. This is the satellite, I think, of ISRO. This is again A47. They make some nice t-shirts and they sent this to me for free. Free Kamal, must hai. Amazing time for free Kamal. Okay, a few things to discuss, man. Lots of things happening in the world. One of my favorite comedians, Raju Srivastav, is in on the ventilators, not keeping too well, obviously. And I generally, I mean, I hope he recovers fast and gets back to doing what he does. I was at a show, a corporate show recently, and one guy came up to me and he said, "Are all of you are doing stand up now and all of that stuff?" Or पहले तो बस वो राजू श्रीवास्तव type लोग थे. And I'm like, dude, are you serious? Raju Srivastav type. No, Raju Srivastav is one of the funniest comedians in India, right? And I remember interviewing him a while back in the midst of the pandemic, and he literally did. I think I don't know how many of you saw this episode, but he was just so kind with his time. He gave me an hour and 20 minutes, and he just literally did stand up for 1 hour 20 minutes. Just sat down and he's just like doing stand up for 1 hour 20 minutes. So if you get the chance, please go watch it. If you're a fan of Indian comedy or just generally interesting conversation, he talks about touring with Johnny Lever and all of that. It's just great. It's so I mean, if you're not a fan of Raju Srivastav, just watch the episode. You might become. I hope he recovers fast. And also, one part of me thinks that he recovers fast and then he has more content. Right? Like that's all comedians. I remember Johnny Bhai also had the same thing happen to him, where it's where he had I think some illnesses, I think some liver issues and all, and then he turned it into tremendous stand-up. So that's what I hope for Raju Srivastav. He's a just absolutely incredible guy. Shavik Bakchi says, Saurabh, why are you wearing Hajmola wrapper? Arey, Hajmola wrapper is not the right color, yeah. What are you talking about? This is not Hajmola wrapper from any angle. This is absolutely normal wrapper. Okay, a few things to please everybody. Just give a few likes so that more people tune in, because that's how these all algorithms work. And at the end of the day, all we are slaves to AI, friends. That's the future of all technology, is slaves to the artificial things that we have created ourselves. Shavik Bakchi has already started weird questions. AMA, should we torture China by making them eat Indian Chinese food? Dude, Indian Chinese food is way better than Chinese food. As you know what, this might be the opening question to ask my guest. I'm just going to bring him on. He's an army veteran. He's also written a wonderful book called Watershed 1967. If you've never seen the show before, let me explain to you how this works. I am going to be talking to my guest and also taking questions in the middle from all of you. So get your questions ready. Every 10 or 15 minutes, I'll just pop back in. So please, everybody, give a round of applause or do OP, etc. For Mr. Probal DasGupta. Hello, sir. How are you?
I'm very well, Sorabh, and great to be here on your show.
Oh, thank you so much. Let's ask this first question, which has been asked by Shavik Bakchi, who says, "Should we torture China by making them eat Chinese Indian food, Indian Chinese food?"
Well, I sure think a lot of people would perhaps agree to that. That Indian Chinese food can. I don't know how you can torture, but you can certainly make them eat and change their tastes if that helps. If changes their taste and help them eat more Indian Chinese. But I must tell you one thing connected to this, that we made them speak in Hindi way back in loudspeakers in the 60s, because they thought that Indian soldiers wouldn't understand any other language. So they said, let's learn Hindi. And that's where we made them learn Hindi. It was very chaste. It was very funny. It also happens across the border at many places where they still play those loudspeakers and speak in chaste Hindi, which you could hear possibly in the 1940s films of Kale Segal. Those kind of dialogue, they still say that Mahan, whatever they say. But it's quite funny that we've made them learn Hindi, a bit of it. and they try to convey messages through that across the border. Yeah. So why not food?
Yeah, why not food? I think and by the way, I've been to China and I met a couple of Indians who were living in China, and they all told me that they're carrying Maggi masala with them to flavor the food. I was like, wow, this is a brand new level of just not being wanting to try anything. But it's very interesting that you mentioned what you just said. That's one of my questions. For those of you who are tuning in, Watershed 1967 is the book, and there is a lot of, I mean, okay, with the terrible everything of war and the destruction and the loss of lives, etc., etc. There's a lot of comedic elements to any war. I think one of the things that you just mentioned was that China at some stage started putting out propaganda and screaming it from the top when chased Hindi, and then India countered by saying something back to them. And was it in Mandarin or what is it?
No, so what happened was that we started playing loud Hindi film music, blaring, and also what happened was some of our there was a para commando unit there in the 60s, which the guys stripped off, and they this sort of you know kind of gave it to the Chinese. They said, here we go. So I think the we and which was again which formed the basis of a complaint by the Chinese, saying that look what you guys are doing. They're doing several things. They're playing Hindi film music. They're doing this. So yes, so we have had instances in the past where we have, like you said, in the middle of something as serious as wars and battles, there are confrontations, and we have made light of the Chinese, as one would say, on certain occasions such as this.
Yeah, it's there's a lot of comedic bits in the book, but I'd like to talk to you about something slightly off center. I think we in a brief chat we spoke about this, like the just concluded CWG. There's a lot of athletes who were from the armed forces. I'd love to know what like, I mean, why that is seems pretty self-explanatory. Like, you're in the armed forces, your fitness levels are definitely going to be higher than any civilian. But how does it work for all these athletes, and how is there such a high proportion of them who are winning medals? Any explanations?
So that no, that's a very contemporary question, and we just off the CWG. And if you see, India's performances have gone up in the last few competitions, whether it's Olympics or CWG. And one of the aspects that we've seen is a large participation or successful participation of armed forces athletes. Uh, there was a scheme that was started in 2015-16 where there was a special scheme which is focused on winning the Olympic gold or winning Olympic medals, and that started in 15-16, where young athletes who were talented were taken under the wing of the army and trained specifically with the focus. Uh, One of the athletes from that time was Avinash Sable, who won the silver at Birmingham this time. The other one, everyone knows his name, Neeraj Chopra. So, services has always focused on sports, and we see the results now because it's more institutionalized in terms of the goals, in terms of TCWG, in terms of Olympics. There's a lot of scientific structure to the training, but services as a as a unit, as an organization, has always focused on sports. In fact, the book that I'm going to write now has 10 stories. One of the incredible stories is of an army officer who went on to win a Veer Chakra while fighting the Chinese in the 1962 war, and comes back and wins an Olympic gold in the 1964 Tokyo Olympics, a hockey gold. He was a splendid hockey player in those days. He's one of the so you have Avinash Sable, who won the silver this time in Birmingham. He was asked. So he said, well, we were trained right from from our early days, which is in what is called one of the various drills and training schedules include something called as a battle physical efficiency test. It's a 5 kilometer run followed by a jump across the ditch, followed by climbing a rope. So there are several. That run is something where you run with your loads, with your boots, with your rifle and your helmet. So Sabli was asked, and he said, after having run the 5 kilometer BPT and the training in the army, it was the training for CWG was became easier. He also served in the CRJ. So along with sports, these various postings, these various areas where they serve in, make you hardier, make you tougher. And then when you bring that to a more institutionalized training form, you have these results.
Yeah, makes perfect sense. Okay, so let's get back to the history stuff. I was reading. I mean, again, great book, as I already told you. It reads like a thriller, and from start to finish. And then there's the epilogue, which is also a lot of fun and very insightful, obviously. And when I use the word fun, I use it very loosely, of course. Um, there was something, a couple of things that struck out to me about way back then. I think that you pointed out, which is that you said that the Americans were more sort of leaning towards Pakistan because Pakistan back then was considered a capitalist economy. And
Yeah.
also, there's another observation that you made, which is where you said that at the time in the 1960s, 10% of the Pakistan population were in the armed forces, and which leads me to believe that I assume that because gender parity back then was like quite skewed. I don't know how it is anymore, but that essentially means that 20% of Pakistani males were in the armed forces, which is quite extraordinary. So I would just love to sort of understand this whole Pakistan being a capitalist and where it stands with regards to now, because I don't think you look at Pakistan and think, or I mean, probably more to India, where you're like, hey, okay, we're definitely more capitalist than Pakistan. But how were they capitalists back then? What is it that they were doing? Was it that they were just opening the economy out to other people, or what is it?
So, Pakistan had been closer to the US right from the start. And if we look at post 1947, Pakistan had opened up their economy. The US had invested. India was closer to the emerging Soviet Union. It was a socialist state to begin with. It was a very different political dispensation at that point of time. Jawaharlal Nehru, and we can go into the various positives and negatives and the debates around it. But then India did what it did at that point of time. It established certain institutions. On the other hand, Pakistan led a very different path, and up until the 1950s, because there were a lot of capital. There was capital infusion. There was U.S. participation, and democracy was there. It started to roll down a slippery slope when President Ayub Khan, then General Ayub Khan, took charge, and a military dispensation came into place. After that, it became an authoritarian, capitalism, where you had an authoritarian leader, and he would decide what to do. That is why I've mentioned in the book that Pakistan ramped up its acquisition of weapons, and it militarized itself greatly in that period between the late 1950s and 1960s. And it was always sitting on the keg, on the edge of belief that they were always insecure due to the fact that well, we have a large neighbor. We do not know what India's intentions are, and therefore the capitalist economy that was growing in Pakistan was overshadowed by the authoritarian regime that took over and invested a lot of time, money, and effort in building a military to take on India, and thereafter run its writ in the local governance over the years, and therefore you see the country having uh, gone down a different path as compared to India in the last four or 5 decades, run by the military, and over a period of time have even radicalized its military from 1970s when General Zia came into power. That's a completely whole different conversation. But Pakistan went from capitalism to authoritarian capitalism to military regimes to a very radicalized form of military regime. So we see this transition, or rather, a path down a slippery slope for Pakistan the last 4 or 5 decades. The book starts at a point in time when Pakistan was at a high, and was registering a higher economic rate of growth than India in the early 60s.
Yeah, and also, I mean, just to take a step back to explain to people what we're talking about, in 1962, the war which India had with China, India lost quite badly, and then there was a war in 1967, which was very, very like planned out between Pakistan and China. So it's almost like they did something which was almost seemed like inevitable, where they decided to Pakistan decided to start the attack on India on this side, and then China decided on this side, and the plan was basically, and then it was very interesting to read because China's attitude to even Pakistan, I think whoever the leader at that time was, essentially told Pakistan that be prepared to lose a few cities. And India was on the verge of like heading towards Lahore at that point of time, and China's like, yeah, go ahead, it's fine. You lose a few cities, but it's for a higher cause. And while reading it, I thought, is it for China's higher cause or Pakistan's higher cause? And this comes to a sort of larger military related question. This gentleman called Anand Krishnan, who's written a book about China, and it
Yeah.
mentions constantly about how the Communist Party has a 100-year plan for everything,
Yes.
as opposed to, I think, other countries that have a slightly shorter run plan. So, do you think when China says something like that, it's part of a 100-year plan, or like what is it? Like, is the plan that they're like, hey, like we look at Pakistan 100 years later as something else, and everybody's missing a beat, or what is it?
No, Saurabh, you've asked the most important question of the century. So it's a 100-year plan. So I must say that no, this is a central question. This is you hit the nail on the head. This is the question that answers China's goal, its ambition, its ways. I always say that nothing that China does is is by instinct. There's no 2 minute Maggie noodles for China. It is a long term plan, and it has always been one. When in the 1960s, so I'll just step back and talk about Anand Krishnan's book, and it is based on a theory, and this theory is pretty much true. That, in 1949, China, when China, in the new China, the China became sort of independent because the Communist Party took over and established communist rule in China. China's aim was to become the most dominant power on earth by 2049. And they have this concept called as Tianxia, which is, they call themselves as the heavens under the skies. Now, I don't know how you can relate, how you can think of a heaven under the skies, but it is for the Chinese.
Heavens
Because
Under the Sky
in the,
reminds you of like a 1990s movie where like Devi is about to come from the heavens under the sky and dance to a song. Like that's the that's the Chinese. It's just Devi stepping down into Anil Kapoor's arms. That's what I imagine with Heavens Under the Skies.
yes, and I all credit to them for believing in it,
Yeah.
and for that long, because they believe that that kind of a movie would happen for them. And 1949, yeah, 1949, and it stems from a mid in the mid 15th century. The Chinese had a stronghold in the region where they were like the Gali Ka Gunda kind of, where the Vietnamese, the Lao, the Cambodian kings, the others would pay obeisance and annual sort of hafta to the Chinese for their protection, and the Chinese thought of themselves as the center of the earth, and that's what they call it, Tianxia, heavens under the sky, center of the earth. That's what they want to regain. That's the position that they want to regain. What happened in the period after the 15th century was that they went through in the 18th and 19th century, they went through a century of humiliation. And Japanese attacked them in the Second World War. The Chinese were in a mess. They had a civil war within the country. So when they emerged out of all of that, they said, "Oh, we have gone through a century of humiliation. The British humiliated us. The Japanese humiliated us. Now we need to find our space in the world." And that is when they started this 100 years war. And this 100 years war is continuing. And Xi Jinping is somebody who wants to accelerate this 100 years war to probably 2030 or something from 1949. So going back to your question, 1960s, it was a part of that. It was part of a plan wherein they wanted to, they believed that India was a competitor in this region, and they wanted to always hammer India down. And what better and an ally to have to do that than Pakistan? who was always ready to be at their beck and call. And that's how it all started.
Yeah, it's also because I think in the midst of the book, when China was sort of attacking Sikkim on one side, right in the midst of that war, they I think announced that they're now claiming Tibet autonomous region, and the timing of it was so specifically done that it's literally what you just said. It's like it seems so instinctual, but you know that this is part of a bigger plan. And even while reading it, I was like, it's just the timing. I mean, just from that POV, they're like, hey, we are waiting for this to happen, and then we are going to announce this.
Yes, yes, and I think what what uh, what happened was that they had kept this plan as a secret. Uh, it just happened that they had to take somebody into confidence, and I won't reveal the name of the Kashmiri politician who went and who was contacted by the CIA spy. CIA was very active here,
Yeah.
and CIA believed that they could be, and they were everywhere. They were they were following politicians. They were tracking what was happening. So they were the ones who found that China and Pakistan were actually in a concert, trying to do a barter that Pakistan would take would take Jammu and Kashmir, and in a war, while the Chinese mounted pressure on the east and took away Sikkim, and there they would call India to the table and do a barter. So that was the plan, to keep India's heads down and continue with their plan in 1965. So that is, and it starts with, there was a lot of intrigue. There were a lot of the one would spy on the other, and you've seen in the book, there's a lot of espionage that carries on right through the 1960s. Kalimpong, I have mentioned perhaps in the book, not as much, but Kalimpong used to be used to be called a nest of spies. Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru mentioned Kalimpong, and I was there a couple of months ago to deliver a lecture at one of the army divisions. Kalimpong used to be called the nest of spies. There used to be caravans going from India to Lhasa, and they would carry news, and there used to be bazaar, and that bazaar, information would be traded. It's like, aaj kitne ka mil raha hai and all that. So they would virtually buy information, and
Wow.
yes, the caravans would bring information from Lhasa and sell it to the in the Kalimpong bazaar, and it was almost and there used to be lots of spies. There used to be the daughter of the Russian Tsar living in Kalimpong. There used to be also Devika Rani's estate, which was the painter Rorich, Svetoslav Rorich, used to own. There was also the Prince of Denmark, not Hamlet, but Prince of Denmark, who used to live there. So there used to be so many people who were pensioners and on a second life as a spy. Or spies, which who existed at that point of time. China also took advantage of a lot of these espionage that was happening during that time.
Yeah, I want to come back to talk about the CIA because there's a lot to cover there. Because I was just fascinated by the CIA presence, so I'd love to cover that as well. Again, the intention here is to sort of drive intrigue towards the book without like trying to step on too much content from the book. If you want to read it, just pick it up. It's a lot of fun. Okay. Before that, I just like to take a couple of chats that have been popping in. Anuradha Ravi has said, finally catching up live after a long time. Thanks a lot for joining us, Anuradha, after a long time. Devesh Srivastav says, Sorabh looking like a lollipop. Absolutely. You know what? We are an esteemed company. Otherwise, I would have said something inappropriate about, things that people do with lollipops, but I'll avoid that. Uh, we have a first super chat that's popped in from Chinmay Sardesai, who says, hey, Saurabh, happy to see you back with great interviews. Thank you, brother. I hope you're doing well. Everything's good. Um, and then, of course, we have, I have this question, which is from Shavik Bakchi, who says, has nobody told Akshay Kumar about this? Which is an extended part of him saying that why is less movies being made about India versus China and more about India versus Pakistan? But the news is that your book is being commissioned by India Inc. as far as I know, and it's going to get turned into a series at some stage. Is that true?
Yes. So I think somebody asked about Akshay Kumar. I think they're probably thinking about who should be in it. So they're trying to figure out. So they're still on. The talks are on. So at some point of time, hopefully we'll see a series, and somebody's desired Akshay Kumar or somebody to be there, but I don't know. It's up to the producers or people who make the series at the end of the day. But yes,
Yeah,
there's
yeah.
something is underway. Yeah.
So Akshay Kumar is going to be playing 19 roles in the movie. Is what is the rumor we can start spreading right now. Okay, we have a controversial question also popping in from Shavik Bakshi. This I'm sure you people have been sort of asking you this question for the last couple of years with relation to the pandemic, and this is a question that I'm sure you get asked a lot. Probably, sir, do you believe that China spread the coronavirus on purpose, or is that just a conspiracy theory?
It started as a conspiracy theory, but I don't think it's entirely a conspiracy theory. There's always, these kind of things will always remain in the realms of conspiracy theory. But the way I would put it is that did China gain an advantage from it? The intent would have been so. The intent would have been so. And if I look at what happened in the Wuhan lab and the how the virus would have escaped from there, and that's a theory again that does rounds. But there are lots of gaps between what actually happened. There was a U.S. Delegation that went there in 2017, and they had observed how the conditions of research and secrecy or security in the lab were not appropriate. So some of these questions were raised at that point of time, which have not been answered very well, neither by China. And if you look at the WHO, the appointment of the WHO chief was also supported by China, and the WHO also was intimated about those cafes in 2017. They didn't do much. So to say it's a conspiracy theory would be a half truth. Well, and also to say whether China was actually instrumental in spreading the virus, we don't have evidence to say that. However, we have going by how China operates, and many times I've said, in the Western template, we always think that adventurism is a way of war. It is not. Subversion, deception, deceit is one long narrative that has been woven around various Chinese campaigns since 1960s and 17, since the Chinese communist governments have been there in the last 50 years. So that's why the question always comes up: was China responsible? There is no evidence to say that. Did China benefit? The intent was there. Yes, China did. And will I put it beyond the realms of China not doing it? No, I wouldn't, given the track record and given how they operate and given it how it is operating at this point. So that's my question, my answer. I don't know whether I've answered fully. There's no evidence, but it is not a conspiracy theory alone.
Yeah, it's unlikely but possible is the answer.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
yes, yes, very much.
Um, okay. Just everybody watching, please do give a like so that more people tune in. We're going to talk about the CA shortly. Just a couple of compliments coming in for you. Seema Wazir says, Probal, your storytelling is fabulous. So
Thank you.
thank you for that. And then Ayush Yadav says, read your book last year and thoroughly enjoyed it. What are your views on film and TV adaptations of military stories? They are able to provide a wider audience, but do they capture the gravitas? Oh, words like gravitas are
Mm.
being used in the chat and all today. Nice. So, what do you think of film and television with regards to how they portray the military, etc., etc.?
So I think it is, of late, I know of a few of my colleagues who have become consultants to
Consultants.
movies.
Yeah.
Yes, and where the seriousness, by seriousness, I don't mean looking serious. By seriousness is the adherence to the nuances, the little tidbits, and right, like the action, the uniform, the way it is, the various things are done, the traditions, etc. So some of these things are being have become better than what they used to be, become more professional. Uh, but I still think that there is a lot to cover, and we still have a lot more to go. I mean, fair distance to go before we have a large number of series or dramas or films which are of a good standard. There are a few of them which are doing well, which have been advised in the right manner and which portray things in the right spirit and manner. But I think people have also become more open, hopefully, and that's to the ideas of to various ideas in terms of how the army is portrayed. It's not just one single line of thinking. So I think that maturity needs to be there over a period of time, and hopefully that will come. If you look at Hollywood, or if you look at films in the West, in Europe as well, uh, the army has, the portrayal of the army has been across different dimensions. It's not just the one uh, halo that would cover all armies actions, but there are several dimensions. Sometimes there are certain debates that go on. So I think we should come to a stage where we are mature enough to have films that have the army, but not in one single dimension alone. So that is what I would like to see at some point of time. But yes, it's become more professional in how it's being portrayed than what it used to be in earlier times. Certainly so.
One of my favorite videos to watch is I think Variety does these, where it's like you have an expert responding to certain parts of filmmaking, and about, like,
Hmm.
say, whether you have a battle expert talking about like medieval battles and how they panned out, or a submarine expert talking about submarine scenes in films. And in my head, I'm just thinking, hey, I would love to see a military expert of India, such as yourself, like even talk about like Border and all those films and see what they got right and wrong. Because I'm sure that the like even replicating the weapons down to the T is probably unlikely. It's just picked up something. It's like, "Arey film city mein mil raha hai, jo bhi le aao." So it's like I would love to see somebody just do an. I think that would be a 9-hour video, just an analysis of Bollywood and across Indian cinema, doing sort of armed forces films. That would be fun.
Right. So there's this film, I was watching the other day called Siege, and it's a Hindi film, and where one of my, somebody who I know had directed the action scenes. The had not directed, had been consulted on the action scenes. And so the moment I saw those scenes, I called him up. I said, you seem to have been very much involved in this, because they seem so genuine, though. So so very much they came alive in terms of how they were portrayed, how the fighting was done, how the actions were carried out. So these things are happening. So good to see that, and that'll bring more people to watch these movies, and yeah, and bring more gravitas. Hopefully, yeah, that's the
Yeah,
that's the
gravitas yeah.
I must end with that word because he had that word in the question.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, I'd love to talk to you about the CIA, because I think this was mentioned in the first few pages of your book that the CIA was trying to figure out what the conspiracy was. And then there's a CIA operative in India who's trying to figure out what the plans for the 1960s, I think starting from 1965 were. There were also accusations that were floating around, I think, at that point of time, which is that Hope Cook, who was the wife of Sikkim's monarch at that point of time, who
Yeah.
was an American. She was an American lady.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And there were just random accusations against her also being a CIA operative, etc., etc. It's not something you hear of too much now. Is it that they've reduced their presence, or is it that we just don't know?
No, they have reduced their presence, I would think. I mean, from that time, and it's today you don't have to be physically present at one place to really have your
Right.
presence, and we know that we're doing this, remotely today, and so that's one example. But going back to how it existed in the 1960s, the CIA had a great presence because, to take a step back, in the 1940s, uh, the Americans were working on the atom bomb. Now I go back to a very different kind of story. So the atom bomb, and in China, there was, in the Xinjiang province, there was uranium deposits, etc., which was available. The Soviets from then on were chasing the Americans in the race for the atom bomb, and in the 1940s. That's why the CIA was also here. And I'm just kind of catching my nose like this, but I'm
No,
just
no,
kind of explaining.
it's great. The genesis of all
Yeah.
these stories is what makes them
Yeah.
so interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. So the Soviets didn't want to be left behind, and they were chasing the Americans. There's the Americans going for the bomb, the Soviets after them, and lo and behold, who's after them? Who's behind them? Number three, the British, because they said that they are already here. How are these guys coming and making a bomb? And we know India very well, right? So the Xinjiang province was, a province rich in uranium deposits, and the Soviets then, that time, a newly formed Soviet Union in the 1930s, 40s, wanted to egg on the Chinese leaders at that point of time to give them access to uranium, and the Americans were worried. So from then on, after the British left in 1947, the Americans were here, and the Americans, they said, B.N. Malik, who was the head of the Intelligence Bureau in the 1950s, they said that every file that went to the Prime Minister's office was seen by the CIA, and that's coming off a book from a secondary source, and the CIA was very much present here. The CIA was more, and the objective was twofold. One is to understand what was happening across the border and here and in India. Second, and more importantly so, they did not want India, and they knew that India was close to the Soviet Union, but they did not want India to become a communist state, and that's why they were here. They also, the third thing was that they were also helping the Tibetan cause. The Tibetans were fighting for their independence at that time. The Chinese were not yet in Tibet. I mean, they had not yet annexed Tibet, and there was a Tibetan rebellion that was building up, which was being supported by the CIA. The CIA would take these Tibetan rebels to Colorado, train them in parajumping, and bring them back to China. And suddenly the Chinese would see people jumping from the sky, and they were the Tibetans who had never seen a plane earlier, and then suddenly they were jumping off the sky and fighting the Chinese. So it was very intriguing. Could write an entire book on what was happening there with the CIA. And talking about Hope Cook, so Hope Cook was this lady from Manhattan who had decided to from Brooklyn, who had decided to come here and on a tourist trip and fallen in love with Palden Thondup. Palden was the son, the prince of Sikkim, son of Tashi Namgyal. So he was going to be the king. So she came and married him, and she became later on the queen of Sikkim. And when the marriage took place, I think the marriage took place in around 1963. Lots of people attended, all premiers, presidents, prime ministers, Mrs. Indira Gandhi, and several other people from across the world attended Hope Cook's wedding, because in the US, and it is, if you look her up in the US, it was in New York Times, it was in various, big global media platforms, because Grace Kelly, who was the Hollywood actress, had gone on to marry the Prince of Monaco sometime before that. And she was thought to be the new Grace Kelly, going up to marry somebody in the Himalayas and becoming this queen of Himalayas. So that was something, in the white mind's eyes in the West, that was a fairy tale story, a fairy tale romance which was taking place. It was not so fairy tale as far as India was concerned, because there was a lot of pull and push. And Hope Cook, it was a very interesting relationship she had with India. She was very friendly to the military officers, especially General Sagat Singh, who appears in my book right through, is one of the central characters. And she was, her husband, Palden Thondup, was an honorary Indian Army officer of the 8 Gurkhas. And he was a friend of Sam Manekshaw, who went on to become Field Marshal. So, but Hope Cook did not quite like the idea of Sikkim becoming a part of India. And she therefore started to have these strained relationships with the bureaucrats and the politicians and the others who would go to Sikkim. And there started this tussle between Sikkim and India. And China, of course, was always ready to play the spoil sport and sort of support Sikkim in whichever way they wanted to. So that started, and there was always that niggling suspicion that Hope Cook was a CIA spy. If you ask me, was she a CIA spy? She wasn't. It was just that she was shooting her mouth off at different places, and it was foot in the mouth syndrome, so to say. But yeah, not the kind of espionage that we thought she would be involved in.
So a question occurred to me while reading the book, which is that Sikkim being like, I mean, a part of India eventually, like that seemed like a little bit of an inevitability after a point of time. Like unless you maintain your own army and your own defense forces, there's a limit to how much you can be a protectorate and all that kind of stuff. Was there ever any like turning point, or was there ever any point where like China's sort of influence in the region was almost reaching tipping point at any stage? Did that ever happen where India was fearful that maybe Sikkim might go the opposite direction, or was that never even on the table?
Yes, it was. In fact, that led to India, led to the accession of Sikkim.
Yeah.
What happened? I mean, the book 67, the Battle of Nathula and Chola, And before we go into the battles, 1965, China wanted to occupy. China had pressurized India during the war when India and Pakistan had gone to war on the Western Front. Very little is known about what China was doing on the Eastern Front. China had mounted a lot of pressure on India to pull back its troops from the Watershed Ridge, and
Yeah.
that's why the name of the book, Watershed, comes from how important that Watershed Ridge became to the existence of India as a country. Because uh, they put pressure. They said, Indians should pull back from Nathula, should pull back from Jelepla. No, if they had come and sat on Nathula and Jelepla, they would have occupied the heights. And for everyone's consumption, if you, in military terms, if you occupy heights, you would always dominate the enemy. Think about robbers sitting on top of your building and you are on the ground floor, and they have the guns and you have nothing. So you would always be dominated by people who are sitting or on higher reaches or higher elevated features on mountains. So if they had occupied those heights, they would have rolled down to Sikkim, and you know, and in the war that followed in 1971, they would have cut us. China would have cut India off at the Siliguri corridor. Now, Siliguri corridor, if all of us take our minds back to that Indian map, is shaped like a chicken's neck, and it's called a chicken's
Yeah.
neck. And
Yeah.
that's the one, that's the one connect in the mainland of India has with its northeastern part, and that is, and that's that's about 20 kilometers wide at certain places, which is not very big for a country like China and the Chinese army to cut off, right?
Yeah.
So that's how they were thinking, that we could cut India out, and we could, and so Sikkim was a tactical, was certainly a strategic aim. In Mao's theory, Mao would call Tibet as the palm, and five fingers, one of which was Sikkim, Arunachal, and a few others, Nepal, Bhutan. So you had palm and five fingers. Sikkim was one of them, and Sikkim was always in China's sights. After the 1971 war, the RNAW, the Research and Analysis Wing, which is the External Intelligence Agency of India, they advised the Prime Minister, Mrs. Indira Gandhi, that this is not something that we can let be not addressed or kept open, because the Chinese had threatened in 65 and then in 67, and also Doklam, which is again not Sikkim but very close, is again in China's sights, because they want to occupy Doklam, and the objective is not Sikkim as much as the objective being the Siliguri corridor, because once you take
Yeah.
the Siliguri corridor, you can really gain an advantage. That's why Sikkim was important at that point of time, and that's what led to India's actions thereafter in 1975.
Yeah, so Alani says Sikkim could have been made an ally like Bhutan, and also that they wanted Ladakh as it's historically part of Tibet. Um, so is that true?
So Sikkim could have been made a part of Bhutan, but Bhutan had been admitted to the United Nations, and therefore once
Hmm.
you've been admitted to the United Nations, you become a part of the larger UN UN ecosystem. So for a country to unilaterally then attack becomes something different. Uh, Sikkim was not a part of the UN, because Sikkim, right from 1950, was a protectorate. By protectorate,
Yeah.
I mean that Sikkim, unlike Bhutan, was never a part of India. Sikkim was a protectorate. Protectorate meant that we would look after the defenses and their finances, whereas but they were to govern their own kingdom.
Okay, we have to talk about one of my favorite what ifs, which is I'll just do this after the reading some of the chats that have been popping in. And one of my favorite what ifs is that if China had gotten involved in the 1971 war, and also we can get into that after these quite a lot of questions popping in. First up, Siddhant Bhatt, welcome back, my friend. Hello, community. Hello to you as well. We have a lot of questions coming in from Anurag. Anurag is very detailed. I think it all stems from him saying, "I want to study my defense studies. Best university in India. Is it Madras University? What job can I get after that? Please help, sir."
Well, I don't. I'm at a loss to answer that question. I think you should certainly study, but what job? Well, there, you know, well, I can't tell what job. But there are several jobs in think tanks, in consulting firms that do research on risks, geopolitical risks, etc. Is that the kind of job you're looking for, corporate, or you're looking for a job in a think tank? Depends on all of that, but certainly a good start, I would say. Madras University, yes, it has a good program there on defense studies, but it'll have its own qualification requirements. Yeah.
Okay, Anurag also asks best 2 or 3 set of books according to Sir about Indian Army post independence 1947, 1962, 1965, 1967, 1971, 1999, OP Brass Tacks, and Operation Parakram History. I was reading it as OP because we used to reading it as OP, then I
Yeah.
realized it's Operation, not
Of,
OP.
of, of brass tacks. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So there are a whole lot of them, and well, you would read Bertil Lintner's book, then J.P. Dalvi's book on 1962. And if I continue to tell you here, probably it will not get lost. But the questions taken, I might post the answers sometime. There are a host of books that are there from 47, 62, 67. 67 is my book, and I would think that this is the only one that is there on 67. You would get many books on 1962 and 1971. Should read Srinath Raghavan's book on 1971, Gary Bass's book on 1971, Ved Prakash, General Malik, who was the general during the Kargil War, his book on 1999 and the Kargil War, and a host of other books. So yes, there's a whole library of books there are written by Indian authors, Indian historians, as well as historians overseas. You must read India's Wars by Arjun Subramaniam, which is like brings together all of
Yeah.
India's wars. All of your questions will be answered in that one book. So that is a fantastic book, and I would recommend that as well. You could read Maruf Raza's book on 1962 on India China, and that again encompasses the entire history of India and China, the last 100 years. So there are various kinds, and I would recommend a host of these kinds of books to you.
Okay, so yeah, everybody watching, please give likes. Standard YouTube protocol is to keep begging for likes every 12 minutes. So please give likes so more people tune in. Okay, I'd love to ask you this what if question about 1971 and the liberation of East Pakistan. And if China had been involved in it, and was it, as I think you make the argument in the epilogue that after 1967 they were quite shaken up and they were like, we don't want to really get involved in this. But were there any circumstances that would have led them to being involved, and also what would have happened if they did get involved?
So 1967 established one truth for China, that they could not overrun India anymore. India was certainly not a great bigger power than China, no, certainly not hadn't become a stronger power than China. China was still the stronger power, but they couldn't overrun India anymore. And India had sort of compelled them to evaluate the perils of going to war and losing people. And I think that is what 1967 had done. It rested the psychological edge in favor of India. So what happened to India and China and the US and Pakistan in 1971? In 1970, the US Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, when visiting China, met with Zhou Enlai, who was the Chinese premier. Zhou Enlai gave Henry Kissinger a book about the 1962 war. And it was written by Neville Maxwell. It was called India's China War. That's another book that one should read. But Neville Maxwell was very much biased towards China. And he believed that it was India's fault that had led to China waging a successful war against India, but it was all India's fault. And Indians were very scared of Chinese, is what the book sort of seemed to indicate to Henry Kissinger. So when Henry Kissinger goes back and the war in the 1971 war happens between India and Pakistan, Henry Kissinger and Richard Nixon are led into believing that anything that China does would scare India. So that is what to the point that they believe that the reason why they wanted China to be involved was that it would make India deploy its troops across two fronts. It
Yeah.
would take away India's capabilities from here and reduce India's muscle in Bangladesh, where it was then East Pakistan, where India was fighting the war, and on the Western Front, and open up a third front actually against China. So it goaded, pressurized China. They even held a meeting in an outhouse, in a safe house in in upper east upper Manhattan, and where the Chinese ambassador was Wang Hua was brought, and Henry Kissinger came, and nobody knew that they were meeting in this this safe house in Upper East Side in Manhattan, and what typically happened was that Henry Kissinger said, "We want you to do this and do that," and the Chinese ambassador just nodded. And Henry Kissinger went back, said that all good, they're all ready, and we've been successful. So that's the difference between communication, how the Western world thinks and how the Eastern world thinks. The Chinese ambassador nodded to everything that Kissinger said, and Kissinger went and told Nixon that, "Hey, President, we are ready. The Chinese are going to help us in our war, and India is going to be pressurized anytime." So when that didn't happen, Nixon said, "Oh, hey, tell the Chinese to do something, man." And this is on record. Fly some planes, get some more people, fly some planes around India, and the Indians are going to be shit scared. This is what he actually said. And they didn't know. They were at their wits' end to figure out how to. But the Chinese did nothing because there were several other reasons. India had signed a treaty with the Soviet Union, which meant that many of these Chinese troops were also on the Soviet border. So India was smart. India signed a treaty with the Soviet Union, and India said that hey, if any third power attacks any one of us, then we'll come to each other's aid. Now, India was never going to go to Soviet Union's aid, right? If the Americans attacked, but India benefited. So India benefited because India said, okay, if the Chinese are going to attack us, you've signed the treaty with us. So what that meant was that there were 400 Soviet divisions along the Chinese border because they had signed that treaty, right? So they were supposed to protect India. And it was a mutual treaty that we'll protect each other, but India benefited. So the Chinese troops were all stuck on that side against the Soviets. And the Americans thought that the Chinese are all ready to fight India because somebody had nodded in the Upper East Side safe house in Manhattan to Henry Kissinger and gone back. But the Chinese never moved. And after the war happened, and the aim of India's concern was that Chinese could move their troops, could cut India out, the Siliguri corridor that I mentioned. But that was India's concern. So India was all prepared at that point of time. After the war, China, Chou Enlai, at a conference, at a seminar in Beijing, said that, he criticized India and he said, we're going to do this, and by the time the surrender ceremony had already happened and Pakistan had already surrendered East Pakistan to India as Bangladesh, and at that seminar there were Indian delegates, two of them, they burst out laughing loudly that Chou Enlai, what is he talking about? Because it's already happened now, because they were just trying to make up for something that they couldn't do during the war. And then they said, India has done something. That's the time they started to criticize India, that India had occupied Bangladesh, and which is not right. Or East Pakistan, then East Pakistan, and the birth of Bangladesh.
I love the idea of a nod basically leading up to right to the topic. Like, he just nodded. That's like, and it's like the whole Russell Peters joke, right? Of us doing this. He could have literally asked for anything at that point in time. He's like, hey, do you want to give us $1 billion? Yes, yes, why not? Just agree to anything. Okay, let's just see. Okay, we have a lot of comments, a lot of chats and all popping up. Before that, I want to talk about something which I've been trying to Google since like a couple of days, because it finds mention in your book very briefly. But I just thought it's such a fascinating thing. I'm not being able to figure it out. This whole concept of Hindi Chini Bhai Bhai, right?
Yeah.
The only reference I get to it is that Mao, I think ages back, had told Nehru that we should align with each other because they'll help us in the long run, etc., etc. And then I think that's the only reference. But I'm just very curious where this, it's so interesting. When India is Indra, that thing was coined, like that phrase was coined by I've forgotten the gentleman's name. That's an interesting piece of history. Yeah, correct. And so I would love to know where this Hindi Chini Bhai Bhai thing came from, and then relatively quickly fizzled out. Like, it took 6 years, I think, for it to just fizzle out pretty quickly.
Yeah.
So I would love to know the origin story of this.
Yeah, and just to take a step back, and you said, how that nod plays out. I think, some of
Yeah,
these things are all a function of nods. The Chinese
yeah.
nodded like this. They'd asked the Indians, they would have done like this, and that meant no help. So,
Yeah.
it all depends on who you're asking. So going back to your question about the Hindi Chini Bhai Bhai thing, at that time. Uh, the whole idea that Nehru, uh, India was, the British were leaving. India was, it was a new nation that was starting. Nehru had a stature as a growing global statesman, a statesman of the new world. Lots of nations were, uh, becoming independent at that point of time in the 1940s. China had become a new nation in 1949. It was actually India which had recommended the inclusion of China in the United Nations. But sometimes the confusion is that India had supported China later. It was not. It was India had supported at that point of time when China was in 1948-49. So China was still not very clear who would ultimately be forming the government. There was Chiang Kai-shek's government earlier, and then the Kuomintang forces, which now govern Taiwan, who were driven away, but they were occupying mainland China, and then China came on. Uh, India as a nation, Nehru and his government's aim was to was to have a larger uh, you know area of peace, and there was no friction between India and China. At that point there was no friction there was no because what had happened was Chinese had not raised the issue of border disagreements early on, and there were indications that were coming. And in retrospect, we can always lay the fault at India's door in terms of not seeing it coming, but India's never seen it coming. India doesn't see it coming even now. So I don't want to go into a lot of that, but I think that has always been the case. India did not see it coming even after China had shut down India's. India had a presence in Tibet, and India had presence in three places in Tibet, and in all those places, the Chinese had come in and occupied, and India had been forced to take a back step and a backward step and withdraw from some of these places. Also, what had happened was the Chinese had come and occupied Tibet in 1950. That was the time there was a divergence of views. India's Hindi Chini Bhai Bhai also stemmed from the fact that Pandit Nehru believed that we should be staying away from the imperial world. We should be staying, there are a whole lot of nations that are being born, and we should live and coexist peacefully. What we did not see coming was that in 1950, the Chinese had occupied Tibet illegally, and we failed to call it out. We also did not call out the fact that the Chinese were making moves in the in the mid 1950s, in the early 1950s, and I say that as a in retrospect as an example of failure of intelligence and analysis and political judgment. It was a failure of historical judgment at that point of time, because we were trying to woo the Chinese despite the fact that intelligence had come in. The Chinese were making roads in Aksai Chin in the early 1950s, 54, and we were wedded to the Panchshir, we were wedded to the Hindi Chini Bhai Bhai thing, and because we believed that it would not amount to war. Even as late as 1958, the Prime Minister had told the Parliament that there'd never be a war between India and China. So I think there was a misreading at many levels. Also, from 1913 is when the Tibetans drove away the Chinese from Tibet, and they actually won that, and they drove away the Chinese. From 1913 to 1950, Tibet, you'll be surprised and shocked, and I was when I first heard it. 1913 to 1950, Tibet existed, but without being in any entity, without having an identity of its own. It was not a nation. It was nothing. It just existed. It was brought to the it was brought to the notice of United Nations, and India did not even support the cause of Tibet as an independent country, which would have solved everything once and for all. India did not. The only Mongolia supported, and Colombia from somewhere else, uh, supported. And that
Wow.
that was in the UN, and they brought the bill to the UN, saying that, oh well, Tibet should be recognized as a country, but India did not. It could be read as misjudgment, certainly so. It was also a case of appeasement, and as Winston Churchill says somewhere, that an appeaser is somebody who feeds a crocodile, hoping it'll eat him last. But that's what happened. Didn't eat us, but did hurt us in 1962.
There's a book by I've forgotten the gentleman's name, called Dividing Lines, which is about, I think, Tibet. I mean, I read it a while back because I was trying to write a book around that region, and it was like quite interesting. Okay, I have a lot of questions, but there's just too many super chats and all coming in. So I'm just going to try and get as many super chat questions in as possible, and then if we have time, I'll do my last couple of questions, which is all about All India Radio and the war, because I think like some of the things that you just pointed out in the middle were very interesting, about how they announced that India was advancing towards Goa before we had even reached
Yeah.
there, which obviously made things hard. So I would love to do that, but a lot of questions specifically coming in from Anurag, so I'll give him his due attention. Anurag already asked, any book suggestion related to operations of military intelligence by the Indian Army?
There's a book uh, by there's a book on Raw by by a former Raw director Sood, and there is
Vikram Sood,
also
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Vikram Sood's book, and there is a book on R.N. Kaur. It's called The Cowboys, spelled differently, Kaw, because he was the first chief of Raw, and he was Kaur,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
that's how Cowboys. And to your earlier point, Sorabh, he was the one who suggested to Indira Gandhi that Sikkim should be part of India.
Oh,
He was somebody who put together Raw, and he was very instrumental. He was instrumental in intelligence, in gathering intelligence, uh, specifically during the 1971 war. So yes, there are books on intelligence.
yeah. I mean, trying to get in touch with him for a while, but I think it's pretty hard to get in touch with the RNAW person unless they want to. It's like, yes,
Yeah,
I was like, sir,
and
I'm trying to get
maybe
in
you
touch
don't
with you. He's
want to.
like,
Maybe you don't want to at that point of time when they want to.
yeah, yeah. Okay. There's another question just popped in from MG, who says, given conventional war between India and China will prove expensive to both countries, what are some steps we citizens can do to keep Chinese aggression in check? Does banning Chinese products help? I think this was like right at the peak of I think Doklam, or I think at that point of time where I think Sonam Wangchuk had also put out a whole this thing, which was about phasing out use of Chinese goods and apps, and he had I think put a 1 year timeline on it. I don't know how many people actually follow through with it, but I'm sure there is some effect to it. But what do you think?
I think it's like you said, phasing. Phasing is an important term here, and it
Yeah,
takes time. We can't currently one of the ironies is that in the last few years the trade between India and China has gone up rather than going down, and also so there are a whole lot of things you could increase the tariffs, and you could encourage local production. There is a lot of talk about how, for instance, India's defense industry is ramping up, etc. uh, Atmanirbharta, but it'll also take a lot of time, given that there is global best practices. There are other things that come in, and for India to really replace Chinese apps, Chinese goods, would require a phasing out, as you mentioned about Sonam Wangchuk. It is also uh, it's a large nation, and it requires the policy to be executed at all levels across different industries, and the policy that encourages the growth of local industries, which will ultimately become the harbinger and the driver of Indian companies, and so to say phase out Chinese goods from the Indian market. But it will take time. It is a phased approach. I do not know how much we have succeeded, but it's certainly something that would take time. At the other end, I would think in today's world, it's not possible to completely cut out every other kind of apps or linkages with other countries in terms of trade. That would continue, but the one aspect that I would focus on is growing our own capabilities.
Yeah, which also takes time. Like again, like that's why Anand Krishna's book is so extraordinary to read as an Indian, because like this whole thing
Yeah,
we keep talking about the manufacturing sector. He's like, look, it's not as easy to set up a manufacturing sector as you
yeah,
think. It requires a lot of like it required like a decade of pre work for it to start happening. So
yes,
yeah.
indeed.
Okay, Anurag, brother, don't no need to spam. I've got a question. I will ask it. Don't worry. You don't need to repeat the question 16 times. You're not at the border where using a loudspeaker towards China. I will get a question. I'm just taking other people's questions. A lot of people are asking. Shovik Bakshi has a fun question to ask. Prabal sir, have you ever been a panelist on primetime news where the host shouts out at everyone? Has that occurred?
I've possibly been unlucky to not have been fun. I don't know whether it's lucky or unlucky, but I've not been lucky. I've not been lucky to be a part of a shouting match. I'll tell you, maybe one,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
and that was a Hindi show, and I happened to be there, and there were a host of people. It seemed like there was a movie, there was a series in the 80s, Ados Pados, and they used to have these 10 windows, and everybody used to be in each window. So I was on one of the windows, and I was so everybody spoke and everybody shouted, and a lot of things happened. So I didn't speak at all, and so at the end, after the show, someone asked me, called me that you didn't speak. I said, well, I was never asked a question. This is a question थोड़ी होता है इसमें. आप खुद पूछ के सवाल भी आप करते हो और जवाब भी आप देते हो. I said okay, but I would rather ask questions. So I don't think they called me for a shouting match after that. So
No,
this was a Hindi show where there were lots of people talking. So that's how it happened.
I did a bunch of them. It was actually I did it because I'm just curious to talk to people, and then I realized this is probably not the best way to talk to somebody. And then I also I shouted at somebody in one of the debates, and that's when I was like, you know what, I'm not sure if I want to be part of this just yet,
I read
because
about
some
something that you wrote. Yeah,
yeah, some lady called me a misogynist because I said that she was wrong, and I was like, just
yeah,
because I call you wrong doesn't make me a misogynist. And then she said something else, and then we had a screaming match. It was just absolutely ridiculous. I think I had it like 2 or 3 times. One of my favorite
right,
moments, I think I speak about this at some stage, is that I was shouting match with this lady about I don't know what. I think this was at the peak of one of those freedom of speech sort of conversations. And then just when I'm leaving, I'm starting the next debate with somebody else, and she just looks at me and she says hello, and I say hello, madam, and then we have a very calm conversation, and that was a far more effective conversation than the one we had on the debate. And it's like maybe that's a better way to have this. It's just have a conversation as opposed to a decibel match. But yeah, it's a great thing. You should do it live at the studio. It's a lot of fun.
yeah.
I would love to do.
What I told him at the end of after he called, I said, आप जैसे बात कर रहे हो वैसे ही हम बात कर लेते तो better होता. It would have been nicer
Huh.
because I think nobody could
Yeah,
hear anybody when you were shouting. But like you said, talking
yeah.
on the phone was easier.
I think they should just start muting people now. It's like enough of this. Like I think some of the channels have started muting each other, but I think it
Yeah,
needs to happen more. I think it happened on a couple of this. They're like, "Madam, your time is up," and they just muted them. I'm like, "Yes, just do this more." There should be a time. This thing where like, hey, each person has 45 seconds to 1 minute to talk. But anyway, um, Alani cannot resist saying, so Sorabh put up a shouting match act on one of those shows, got into character. Yeah, fully. And the thing is that the vibe of it just pushes you into it. Where because initially pop up, you're like, I'm a reasonable person. I can have a normal conversation. And then somebody like, you comedians are all thieves. And I'm like, wait, what? So, yeah. Okay, a lot of questions have popped in from Anurag. I'll try and take whichever. I think this is a good one from Anurag. First of all, thanks a lot for your super chats, Anurag. Appreciate it. This is an interesting one. Anurag says India's best defense minister, according to you, George Fernandez, 1999, or Jagjeevan Ram, 1971, or whatever other option. I think he's given a couple
yeah,
of
yeah, yeah.
options. I mean, whatever
I
you
was
choose. Yeah.
looking for that. It was like a KBC question. Is there an option C or is there on a friend or something or just something?
Yeah.
There's going to be two more that you're going to send my way. But yes, best defense minister. I would think YB Chavan, 1964 was very played a key role, and I wouldn't say that George Fernandez or Jagjeevan Ram weren't good. Yes, they were defense ministers at very critical times in critical wars. The reason why I would think the two names that come to my mind specifically, if I were to talk about the best defense ministers we've had, one of them was YB Chavan in 1960s, in the early 1960s, because India was going through a transition. Remember, the 62 defeat made the Chinese soldier look 10 foot tall. It was known as a 10 foot tall Chinese soldier. So that ghost kind of haunted the political class, the military leadership, the social class, everybody. So in that context, the defense minister at that point of time changed the culture of how the Indian armed forces were run and how the defense, the strategy was eked out, etc. Because what he did was he allowed the armed forces to function with greater autonomy, and that was, it may all sound very simple, but that was the only thing that was not, and that's a big thing. That was something that they couldn't do earlier. Krishna Menon wouldn't allow the armed forces to function uh, you know in an autonomous manner, which his successor did. That changed the way India looked at the 1965 war. That changed the way India looked at 1965 war more as an offensive action. Before that, India had always been defending. In 1965, when after Pakistan attacked, India decided to, you know, go around and attack Pakistan at Lahore in Punjab. So that is how the defense minister, you know, was able to, and he was at the front. He was with the forces. He had a good ear of listening, and there's a book about him written by his then secretary, and he had an ear to the ground, and he was a good listener, and he would, and that's all you want. I mean, as a politician, you are with the specialists, you allow them to function. It's a very simple ask, but it's also a tough ask. Most politicians aren't able to do that, right? And then you had Arun Singh in the 1980s, during the Bofors scandal. Why I would rate Arun Singh as one of the better defense ministers is because, again, he had a very good rapport with the then Chief General Sundarji. And the way Indian armed forces after 1971 had actually gone into a sort of a somnolent sort of a phase where, oh, hum log jeet ke aa gaye hain. Iske baad you go to sleep in the 70s, so to say. It is General Sundarji who woke up the Indian Army in the 1980s, and in consonance with Arun Singh, who again allowed him that autonomy. They worked very well together. The then Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi, General Sundarji, and Arun Singh for quite some time before they fell out. But Arun Singh and Chavan is, our defense ministers I would rate really highly. And George Fernandez during the time of '99 did a great job as well. So, yes, there you go. The two ministers, the two defense ministers that I would. And if you ask army veterans of that time, they believe that Arun Singh was somebody who knew the requirements of the army better than any defense minister had before him or after.
Do you think it should be necessary for somebody who's a defense minister to have a defense background?
I think in India, and India is uh, one of the countries that hasn't had one with a background, except for Arun Singh, who knew, but he was a civilian, but he
Hmm.
understood. If you look at the US and the UK, many of their and the Russians, of course, Soviet Union has had a very different kind of a political construct. But if you look at democracies, the US and UK have had many of their ministers or parliamentarians. I don't have the exact stats, but I think about 24 or 25% of their the sitting parliamentarians in UK at one point of time had served in the armed forces at one point or the other. And given the fact that we sit in a neighborhood where we have two adversaries with whom we have had a history of conflict, we have had internal insurgencies, we have had various breakaway factions, etc. So it is important that somebody who is a defense minister comes with a background and understanding of the field as much as a finance minister who comes to handle the ministry must and should.
I mean, it seems pretty self-explanatory. Every time I talk to somebody from the armed forces, I ask this question. I'm like, it seems pretty self-explanatory that that should be the rule, right? I mean, it seems like,
Yeah.
I mean,
Mm.
since whatever 21% of your entire budget is going to something, and if it's something you don't really entirely understand, then
Yeah.
what are you really doing there? And then I think the thing is that they're coming in as you said, consultants and all that kind of stuff. But that's not really the same thing as knowing exactly and being the final decision maker on something like this. So yeah, all for it. What is the why do you think there is a sort of skepticism about it? Is it that politicians don't want to like let go of any ground in their world, and they think that if it starts, then that's the rule? What is it? What is the skepticism? Is that what's the logic behind not having it?
I think if we take a step back, you go back to the step back goes back to 1950s.
Yeah,
It's a long
it's a
step
big
back, but
step. Yeah.
big step back. But there is a mindset, and that mindset, and I go back to history as one of the the founding reasons as to why we are why we are where we are and what we do. When after India became independent, the Indian army was seen with a measure of distrust for quite some time. The reason for that was that the Indian Army uh, had fought the Second World War and had been fighting on as part of the larger British Army and part of the Allied Army in Europe and Africa and elsewhere, and it was a belief that that army had now become Indian Army, and so therefore and there was also a time in the 1950s when lots of coups were happening in our neighborhood. The the Pakistani president Ayub Khan was a general who had taken over, and across the world there were coups happening in Africa, in Asia, and South Asia. So there was a sense of fear, and which was felt in the 1950s as well, when we had General Cariappa as one of the more strong chiefs, and Nehru was he knew Cariappa well, but at the same time there was not enough comfort in the army having a say, and therefore the defense minister at that point of time also wanted to interfere, wanted to run the army, wanted to run the way strategies and wars were run, which led to the disaster of 1962. And then you had a change in heart and all of that, but somewhere that ghost lurks in the background. We've broken away from the 1960s. The Indian Army of 2020 is very different from the Indian Army of 1962. But uh, specialization is not been our forte. And I think, I would agree with you if that's the case. That, yes, politicians are wary. Politicians wouldn't want somebody with an army background and understanding, a general or a chief or somebody who has a specialized understanding of these services to to be a defense minister. I think it is not current. It's not present or now. It has been there for 5 decades. It's a cultural thing, and we need to overcome it at some point of time. We need more specialization, given the fact that the defense imports and the defense, you know, the integrated force approach, etc., the modernization of the defense forces warrant the vision and eye of somebody who understands them grounds up. I think.
Sorry. Yeah, sorry, I muted myself and forgot to unmute. See, this is I literally proved to myself why this should happen on debates. There's somebody doing construction noises above my house and this pressure cooker ka city, so it's
Right.
just a lot happening. This is like on both fronts is what we're
Right.
talking about here. Completely agree. Okay, we have. I'll take one more question from Anurag. Anurag, you've asked a lot. But let's take. Okay, let's try this one. Let's try this one from Anurag, who says we can easily travel from Rajasthan to Europe by road. Pakistan never allows us access to its roads. Don't you think it's necessary to break Sindh and Balochistan? We make them independent. That's a pretty controversial question to ask, I think, isn't it?
So, I, I, I always, in today's world, the one thing that one would look at is, Pakistan is weighed down by its own set of contradictions and issues, why do you want to go there? And
Yeah.
yeah, so and geographically, India. It is a large country which has its set of different kinds of issues. Why would you want to embrace another land? I mean, it's there is a thought. There is a lot of talk around whether we should integrate a land which has been which separated us from us in 1947. I think Pakistan has its own set of contradictions, and um, given that there is also the role of China inside Pakistan, inside a land which was occupied by Pakistan, given away to China in Gilgit, etc. So there are a whole lot of things, and when we talk about Balochistan also has a movement of its own. So
Correct.
there are lots of issues in Pakistan. Pakistan is weighed down by its own sets of various contradictions, and you know do we need to go to Balochistan? Maybe Balochistan would all decide for themselves, Balochistanis, as to where they would go and how they would, where
Correct.
they would want to go. So I don't think that we could make a road there and go there. It's not practical. It's not just controversial. It just takes our it's not doable. It's not something that's even on the table for discussion anywhere. You We look after our country. We look after our country better. I think that will help us in greater ways than assimilating another set of land and people who have got their own sets of fights. So yeah, that's what I think.
Okay, I want to ask you the last question, which is that I think we discussed this, which is the
Yes.
Harbhajan Singh temple. And I visited it when I went to Nathula Pass. And again, by the way, if you get the chance to travel to Sikkim, please do go. Try and go during a time when I remember going at a point when it was foggy and it was raining and it was just absolutely gorgeous. And I passed, I forgot the lake, which now they've, I think, cut a part of the lake to create a highway or whatever it is. But it was gorgeous, and I remember going there, and then I went to the temple also, which is great. But a fantastic story, which is that but why specifically him? Why did he specifically get a temple in his name?
So you know, Harbhajan Singh was part of a patrol. This happened after 1967. I think it happened around 1969. And Harbhajan
Yeah,
Singh was a part of the patrol, and he fell down a deep gorge and died, and his body was washed away in the river. One night, one of the military commanders had a dream, and and Harbhajan Singh was a sepoy at that point of time, serving in the Indian Army, and he had died. He had appeared in his dreams, and in his dreams he seemed to say that you build a temple for me, and that's how I would protect you. And I said something of that nature appeared to this military commander in his dreams, and I would, and then a temple was constructed for him, and then it's also a sense of faith, sense of faith. And in these Himalayas, in these high Himalayas, um, where you don't have much around you, you seek such kinds of, and it's not just in Sikkim, in the Himalayas, you'll find it at Pir Babas and little temples, little locations where people pay obeisance, pay, people go and do their matha take, because that is how in these Himalayas, in these mountains, some of these things are form a great give you a great sense of belief. And it's not just the Indians, also the Chinese also leave a chair on the side when
yeah,
they have these peace talks between India and China. One chair on the Chinese side and one chair on the Indian side is left vacant. And Baba Harbhajan has been is that symbol, that beacon of peace for all these years. This temple exists, and I just build on what you talked about Baba Harbhajan. So Baba Harbhajan, once he died, Harbhajan Singh, that temple was built because everybody had that faith that he would protect us, he would save us in the inclement weather and against adversity, etc. Harbhajan Singh died, but his story began after his death. That's the incredible part, that he
he was never retired. He was still living there, and every year his Harbhajan would be given leave, and Harbhajan's the suitcase, the trunk would be carried from Sikkim down to New Jalpaiguri. From New Jalpaiguri, it would be taken in a train by two soldiers to Kapurthala, which was his home place, and would be brought back to the to his location. And this continued, and Harbhajan Singh started to get promotions every few years, and finally he retired, uh, from service a few years ago, and he was retired with full honors. And but that is that belief that how someone who has passed instills a degree of faith, and that temple is an ode to that faith of the soldiers at those heights in such weather. And that is how the story goes. And Baba Harbhajan's temple still is there. It exists, and it has its uniform as well. So if you go there, you can see his uniform in that temple.
No, it's a very interesting story, and it's again, as you said, it's about, like, I think, faith and all that, just being more important.
Yeah.
Okay, this is the last and final question we take. By the Shavik Bakchi has said, just wondering what would happen if Anurag gets Probal sir's number. No, listen, Anurag is a curious man. Man, it's always curiosity should be rewarded. So just keep being curious, man. Anurag, I'm sorry I can't take all the questions. Yes, sir.
Yeah. So one quick thing, so I always believe that stories must be told, because
Yeah.
and there's that old African saying, and to the question, I just remembered that till the lions learn to write, the history of a jungle will always be written by the hunter. So it's important that we know the stories, we know what's happening. Otherwise, somebody else will write your story, and that happened in 19. And I said that a little while ago, that somebody else will write your story. Somebody will write your story in a manner that is not true. And Neville
Yeah.
Maxwell wrote the story of 1962 and steered American opinion on India and China. So it's important that we tell our stories, that we tell them and we narrate them many times over.
Okay, so this is the last question we'll take. Anuradha Ravi, this is the preamble before the question. By the way, my question is more on lighter note, but would be good to get an answer from him. And this is a super chat that's coming from Anuradha Ravi. After a long time hearing from Anuradha Ravi, who says, do you think India in hands of army for strategic decisions will be more disciplined than in the hands of comic politicians who thrive in polarization? I mean, I think, as you already mentioned, which is that,
Yeah.
yeah, please go ahead. Yeah,
Sorry,
I'll just change the view a little
I,
bit. Yeah.
can you show me the question
Absolutely.
again?
One second.
I
Yeah.
couldn't see it.
Where's it gone now? Sorry. Here it is. Here.
In the hands of the army? Okay.
For strategic decisions, will be more disciplined than in the hands of comic politicians who thrive on polarization. And then she clarifies that it was slightly on a lighter note.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Yeah. No, I think we are a democracy and we're good this way. There's always been a fear that India would be taken over and become a militarized country, which has not happened, which will not happen. India is a super strong, very strong, robust democracy and will continue to remain. But it's important to understand the role of war. And I go back to a saying by Little Heart, who said, if you want peace, prepare to understand war. Uh, and I leave it at that, in terms of how it is important to understand war to ensure that we have peace within and without. And that's how I would think of the entire scenario. Just a quick one, sort of the role of General Sagat in the entire 3-4 decades, and that is again one example of how a general. And you spoke about Goa, while everybody was thinking about surrounding Goa, हम लोग side में बैठते हैं, we'll surround Goa, we'll put pressure and we'll do all of that. General Sagat believed that we need to go to Panaji and drive at the heart, at the soul of the enemy. This is what happened in 1971 as well, when India had actually thought there was no plan. Do you know the plan was not to capture Dhaka. The plan was to sit and pressurize Bangladesh. There was no plan before the war. There was no plan to actually capture and occupy Dhaka. There was no plan. The plan was typically to go and put pressure, go around, go to Bangladesh, capture territories, but not capture Dhaka. There was no plan to really, capture Bangladesh as such. General Sagat believed otherwise, and he was the one who was responsible for the capture of Dhaka. And how there's one little story in Agra in 1960s, when 1963,
Yeah.
after the annexation of Goa, when an American couple, went up to him at a hotel in Agra, at the Clark's Hotel in Agra, and they said, oh, we recognize you. We've seen you in Lisbon. So he says, why? How have you seen me in Lisbon? I never went to Lisbon. He says, no, we have seen you in Portugal. We've seen you in Lisbon on the walls. We've seen your face. Because the Portuguese have announced a reward of 10,000 US dollars in 1962, 63. So which is a little. I just digressed it a little bit. But General Sagat, his plans, his maneuvers at every war spoke volumes about his understanding of the battlefield, and it also goes to show that if to for wars, leave it to the generals, but in order to frame politics, it's important to understand war if you want peace. In democracy, the politicians will always have run the show, but it's important to understand how things are run, and it's important to have therefore people in important positions who have had an experience, have a specialized understanding of the field, and that's where it goes back to your early question, Sorabh, about defense ministry.
Sagat Singh, I had a lot of questions about him, but yeah, it's. I think there's so much in the book. Like there's many heroes mentioned, but like if you're looking at the probably focal point for a lot of the parts, it would be Sagat Singh. So I'm just saying that, hey Akshay, get your hands on that role as quickly as possible. Akshay Kumar or Tapsi Pannu, those are the two people playing biopics a lot. So either of those two options is, just a fantastic story, and about how he sort of almost defied orders a couple of times, and then like Natula Pass wouldn't have been in India's control if he hadn't defied orders, etc. Just a fantastic story. Sir, thank you so much for your time again. Watershed 1967 is the book. I will put it in the link description, as well as the pinned comment. Go buy it as well. Anything else you'd like to plug? Anything you'd like to tell people to do? Please go ahead.
Well, thank you very much. As I said, it's always good to look at history, and then you understand the context of what's going on, how things are, especially in the case of India and China. It's a story that hadn't been told for many years. At various places, people ask me why it was not told. There are those reasons you can look up. And you can evaluate for yourself why this story was not told for many years. When I went to talk to the sources, and I spoke with a bunch of sources, veterans who actually fought the battle in 1967. And just to correct it a little bit, it was actually a set of battles and not a full scale war, but it changed the the narrative that followed between India and China. So when I spoke with these sources, whenever I would go to speak with these sources, they had such robust memories of that time, of those battles, of what happened. Every moment they could recount very clearly. There are also espionage stories in the book, and there's one story that that happened in Beijing, where they put diplomats behind bars, and Indira Gandhi followed suit, and she gave a tit for tat, and she also put the Chinese embassy under siege, and they were under house arrest too, to the extent that the Chinese planes had come for refueling, and we didn't allow them to. We didn't give them fuel for a while. So a lot of these things, these little tidbits. The story. The more I dug into the research, the more I was fascinated by what lay underneath. There is a story about two pilots, and I wouldn't name them, two Indian Air Force pilots who were responsible, who were under orders, of course, who bombed the city of Aizawl in Mizoram. That's the only time India has bombed its own people. These two pilots, fighter pilots, went on to become prominent political figures and ministers in later lives. I would leave it for you to discover.
The names are there in the book. You know, it was one of the questions I'd written, but yeah, for finding out the names, go check it out. Thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it, sir. I'll just say some goodbyes to people. Thanks a lot. Take care. And I really appreciate you taking so much time. Over an hour and a half we spent together. Really, really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, Sorabh. Thank you so much for having me on the show. I really appreciate it. And everybody on a Saturday and just before independence, what better a subject to talk about than a victory that was forgotten 50 years ago?
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you so much to Probal DasGupta. Okay. Thank you, sir. You can leave if you want to. No problem at all. But thanks a lot to everybody who tuned in, and thanks to all the super chats that popped in. Anurag asked many more questions. I'm sorry I couldn't take all your super chats, Anurag. I appreciate all of them. Very kind of you. And also have to take this comment by Ayush Yadav, who says, wake up with Sorabh. The greatest scene of Border is when Jackie Shroff gives Sunny Deol a thumbs up from a MiG-21. Absolutely conceivable. Listen, there's a lot of scenes in that movie which you look at now and you're like, that's a little absurd. But yeah, I guess it's the bigger thing. Couple of things to mention. We are doing a live on Independence Day as well. And to keep the momentum going, everybody's going to be talking about independence and joy and freedom and all those kind of things. We're going to talk about something completely different and completely ridiculous. Three of my friends who are comedians are going to be watching the first episode of Crime Patrol. We're going to be discussing that. So that's going to be absolutely nonsensical. And also next week, we're going to be having Prakhar Ke Pravachan. I'm figuring out the date for him. I think probably will be Wednesday. CFC Blues says with Kunal Kamra. I'm going to ask Kunal Kamra. I mean, again, I've honestly not gotten down to it yet. He's messaged a couple of times earlier to come on the show. So we do that as well. Lots of shows coming up as well. If you are around any of these cities, please come. Pune is on 20th. Mumbai is on 21st. Sorry, Navi Mumbai is on 21st. Mumbai is on 26th. Bangalore 27th. Chennai 28th. And then in September, we have Nashik on 10th and Dubai on September 17th. Tickets are on sorabpanth.com, which I will put right here. I also have one last thing to tell you, which is that I have come in the cover of HT Brunch, which is some insanity. I didn't expect it. And this is the current cover of HT Brunch, where it's me and my sister. And as you can see, this is a HT Brunch cover in which I have come, and my sister has covered my face. I mean, this is so typical. This is so absolutely typical that she just covered my face, dude. I mean, how is this fair? How is this something that's allowed in the world? So yeah, I was just saying that my sister covered my face and ruined my one opportunity to be ultra famous, which I am not. I will put the link for the HT Brunch thing as well. Go read it. It's a fun read. We had a nice conversation. Also, you can find some really awkward photographs of me learning how to smile. The photographer was sick of me saying I don't know how to smile, and I don't. So that's the article of HT Brunch. Do give a look at it and see what do you think. Superb. Ayush Adev says Sorabh call Boria and discuss the recent CWG. Boria Mazumdar? Okay, I don't mind calling up Boria Mazumdar. Anyway, thanks a lot, friends. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. And take care of yourselves. Love you all. Marry me. Goodbye, everybody. See you.